afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have here Professor Emma Lejeune from the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Boston University. Emma got her PhD in computational mechanics from Stanford University, and then went on to University of Texas at Austin, where she was working in the Oden Institute as a O'Donnell postdoctoral fellow. And then she spent 2 years there and then went to Boston University. Her work is in the general area of computational mechanics, and in particular in applications with heterogeneous materials and biological materials. And today she's going to tell us about her work in trying to integrate data-based approaches and physics-based computational approaches. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. All right, so just as a very brief introduction, I started at Boston University in January 2020. So it's been sort of an interesting few years, and this is just a screenshot of my research group with graduate students Saeed, Hiba, Kwan, Ling Zhao, and Jeffrey. And the work that I'm going to be presenting today has been done, by me, but then also very much by all of them. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge them. And then also a group of fantastic collaborators who have informed this work in sort of every step of the way, both in motivating us to develop new methods, but then also in direct collaborations on specific problems. So what does our group do? The thing that sort of ties a few disparate research topics together is this workflow of essentially large data sets to curated data to computational models. And that's sort of been the thing that we've been kind of thinking about and excited about. And this sort of is the kind of methodological paradigm that is the foundation for a few different applications that we've been thinking about. So the one that I'm going to discuss today is kind of in this realm of mechanical data analysis, so sort of mechanics machine learning crossover. We're also really interested in enabling high throughput experiments, largely in biomechanics and mechanobiology, and I'll have a couple of intro slides on that just to give you all a flavor for it. And we're also really interested in understanding where mechanics is important in biological and then also bio-inspired systems. And yeah, basically we love mechanics, we love computation, and kind of bringing those two worlds to everything that we do. So I'm going to start this talk with just a few very small snapshots of projects that we're working on, largely with collaborators, that are sort of tied to this first part of the pipeline, so this sort of large data sets to curated data sets component. And then essentially, I'm going to talk a little bit about the second part of the pipeline, and really our vision over the next several years is to have projects that go all the way through. But right now, we've been sort of on two tracks, building out methods for here and methods for here. But we're very much anchored in the applications I'm going to show. So this is one just very brief snapshot of a problem that we've been really interested in. We're part of the CellMet Engineering Research Center that is focused on engineering patient-specific heart tissue, both for repairing the damaged heart, but then also for things like drug discovery. And what our collaborators have been able to do is they've been able to develop protocols for taking cells from patients in a very minimally invasive way, reprogramming them into stem cells, and then differentiating them into cardiomyocytes, and being able to perform experiments on patient-specific heart cells to try to sort of understand how different drugs might impact them and things like that. And what the data that they're collecting kind of looks like is some of these images that are shown down here, where essentially these bright lit up fluorescent parts let us see sort of what the contractile units of the heart cells are actually doing. So those bright parts will move together and come farther apart. But the thing that's kind of complicated is that these images in movies can be a little bit messy. It can be hard to go from an image in movie to essentially some quantity of interest that will allow you to do something simple like compare between two groups, or ultimately something maybe more complicated, more interesting, building out a computational model. So one chunk of our research has been focused on developing software to enable this. This is just one example from that particular project. And here we're essentially looking at sort of some very basic things like segmenting out individual structures, tracking between frames, but then also bringing our background in mechanics, and in this case, kinematics, to come up with mechanically informed quantities of interest, like maybe collective deformation gradient over a whole cell, and trying to understand how individual units on a subcellular level correspond to whole cell behavior and whole cell emergent behavior in particular. We've also been really thinking about how we can take this data and get it in a very reproducible way into something that can interface nicely with a computational model. And we've been building out these tools. In this example, we've been thinking about these cells as spatial graphs, and we're building towards essentially a computational model that's able to leverage large data sets of these. This is just sort of the snapshot that shows this first step of going from these data sets to these curated data. Moving up one spatial scale for another project that we're really excited about, we have collaborators over in BME at BU who have developed this 3D model of wound healing. And we're basically developing software to pull out quantities of interest. Here we show software for automatically pulling out the boundaries of a wound as it's closing. But we're also really interested in things like tracking subdomains and trying to really be able to inform a mechanical model with full field data. And again, just sort of a flavor of the types of problems that we're moving towards. And then again, up one more spatial scale for another project Snapshot. We're working with some collaborators at Sandia to leverage large data sets of brain scans and be able to go from those to traumatic brain injury simulations in essentially an automated and reproducible way. So these snapshots are all basically just to explain to you why we're so excited about heterogeneous biological and then also bio-inspired materials. This upper row shows an example from the wound healing project. This middle row shows an example with our collaborator at UT Austin on heart tissue. And then this lower row is just a bunch of Creative Commons license images of biological tissues. And what you can see is that they're all quite heterogeneous. So as I jump into sort of the main part of this talk, where we're talking about this curated data to computational models pipeline, really, this is sort of the motivation for why we're thinking about heterogeneous materials as the problem that we're starting with. So as many of you, perhaps all of you, are quite familiar with, there have been many, many machine learning approaches to exploring heterogeneous material behavior. We have experts on this sitting in this room. And the idea here is that one can construct a metamodel or a model of a model that's constructed by training a machine learning model on a data set, and in this case, input patterns that match up to some output quantities of interest. And what this can allow you to do is it can allow you to essentially run your computations very, very quickly and enable multi-scale modeling, material design optimization, uncertainty quantification and sensitivity analysis, real-time prediction, data integration, and much, much more. There are all of these applications that benefit from these approaches. And there are also a ton of researchers who have been really dedicating a lot of time to doing this effectively, right? I made this slide. You can see the dates. I made this slide in 2020. It kind of already feels a little bit out of date, right? If I were to make it today, I would have maybe totally different examples from papers that have come out more recently. But one thing that is a little bit limiting, at least in my eyes, is really this idea that there isn't necessarily a clear picture of what types or architectures of metamodels will work best on engineering mechanics relevant data. And this is important for people who care about methods development, because you want approaches to be able to say, the method I'm proposing is more effective than this other method. But it's also important for people who maybe are just users of these techniques and look out at the literature and don't necessarily know where to start. So what we've kind of been thinking about is, what if we look out at other fields and look at what some work that other fields have done to address these issues? And the obvious choice is to look over at computer vision, right? So this slide shows a couple of example data sets from the computer vision research community, probably the two most popular ones. We have ImageNet and MNIST. And critically, the barrier for entry for working with these data sets is super low. You can download MNIST in one line of code. At this point, you can probably download it on your phone if you wanted to for some reason. And maybe easy is a strong word, but it's possible, really, to compare different machine learning models through their benchmark performance on these data sets. So what my group has really been thinking about over the past couple of years is, can we potentially contribute something similar for mechanics research? So we would like to be able to put out open access benchmark data sets into the world that other people could use in their own research for a variety of purposes. And sort of as we've been working on this, we perhaps started in a little bit of an ad hoc approach motivated by specific problems that we were interested in. But recently, we've been really trying to take a step back and try to think, like, what are our motivations for doing this, and how can we potentially do this more effectively? So what we've sort of come down to is 3 big motivations. And I would love to hear from people either in questions or during or after, and any other ideas that people are thinking about, because this is very much a topic that we approach humbly. The first motivation that we've really settled on is this idea that benchmark data sets are potentially important for both education and then also research dissemination, right? In our machine learning classes, we learn how to categorize, flowers and numbers. It would be nice to have some mechanics problems to look at right away. At least it would be nice for me. I don't know, I like mechanics best. But then furthermore, when people publish papers, it can be quite difficult to essentially disseminate results and show how your model is working. And having basically an open access benchmark data set that you could state your performance on would potentially make that easier. So that's one big motivation. The second big motivation is the one that I kind of introduced first, which is this idea that there are so many different machine learning methods out there. Which ones are most effective on mechanical data? And mechanical data has interesting nonlinearities in it. It has interesting formats for inputs and outputs. Which machine learning methods, perhaps originally developed for other applications, will work best on mechanical data specifically? And then the third motivation, which is perhaps really the kind of most interesting one, is this idea that there are all these things that are special about mechanical data, right? And what machine learning methods can be motivated specifically by the things that are special about mechanical data? So, maybe physics-informed neural networks, multi-fidelity modeling, those sorts of things. So these are our 3 sort of big pillars, our big motivations. And we've been working on this collection of open access data sets. You can see a bunch of snapshots here, and I'll talk about a few of them as I go through this talk. But I think, again, we're really approaching this problem very humbly. So we had an opportunity to write a post on iMechanica, and there are a lot of nice comments that really contributed to this conversation. If you wanted to comment, I would still respond, just a little plug. And then furthermore, we're also working on this website of open access mechanics data sets, where essentially anyone who we encounter who is sitting on an open access mechanics data set and has some sort of permanent URL that we can link to, we've been sort of reaching out and saying, hey, can we link to your data, your code, your manuscript, and perhaps define a relevant challenge that perhaps you've already established a baseline on. So this is just a very kind of an informal resource that we've been working on, and we're hoping to build out. And yeah, if this is something that interests you or something that you would like to contribute to, please don't hesitate to get in touch. So back to sort of these pillars, starting with education and dissemination. This was sort of perhaps what got us started down this path. So the first sort of benchmark data set that we introduced is kind of a play on this popular MNIST data set for computer vision, where essentially we've taken the 28 by 28 bitmaps from the computer vision benchmark data set, and we've just converted that into heterogeneous material properties, and we've run really simple finite element simulations. So the inputs will be these 28 by 28 bitmaps. It's kind of almost a drop-in replacement for the original MNIST. And then the outputs are things like change in strain energy, reaction forces, full field displacements, those sorts of things. And part of the reason why we did this is kind of just for fun. It has name recognition. It's a recognizable problem. But the other reason why we did this is because this data set is genuinely a nice size. Anyone can download it on their computer, but it's also large enough to meaningfully train neural networks and look into some deep learning approaches. Since developing the original mechanical MNIST data set, we've also built it out in different directions in ways that kind of have enabled us to explore different problems. So we have multiple load cases, we have the fashion MNIST pattern, we have different simulation fidelities, and then we also have an example with material nonlinearity, where we essentially have a phase field model in there with full field damage. And all of these data sets are hosted through our institutional repository. And if you want to download them or use them for any reason, please go ahead. They're all shared under open source licenses with these additional resources. So this has kind of been our first thought on benchmark data sets towards education and dissemination. Now I'm going to talk about another sort of project snapshot that one of my students worked on, where we were really thinking, how can we adapt machine learning methods that are out there to mechanics data, and how can we set this up in a way so that if someone comes along and does it better than us, we'll know about it and can start using their method instead of ours, because we want the best performance, right? So the things that we were wondering about, right? Can these machine learning methods capture the nonlinearities that are inherent in a lot of mechanical relationships? And then also, can these computer vision methods be adapted to mechanical inputs and outputs? So maybe like complicated geometry, things like that. And a lot of other people have been working on this as well. There's a lot of really wonderful work out there that we kind of read and digest and try to build from. I'm going to show just a little project snapshot that's focused on these first two columns right here, where we're going to be predicting full field quantities of interest. So basically going from the input bitmaps to some full field output. In the first case, it's going to be full field displacement, and in the second case, it's going to be just full field damage. So if we turn to computer vision and try to pick up a method from there, the obvious thing to kind of look at is semantic segmentation, right? So these full field segmentation problems. So our starting point was to read a few of those papers, try to see what was kind of popular out there, and then try to adapt those methods to our mechanics-specific data. So again, displacement fields, strain fields, damage fields, those sorts of things. And these are results from basically picking up sort of the first kind of off-the-shelf recommended method, which is a UNet, a specific type of convolutional neural network that doesn't force all of the data net through a bottleneck. And these are the results of a pretty standard UNet trained on our mechanical MNIST fashion equibiaxial extension data set. And the title of the data set is a mouthful. It's not necessarily important. The point is just that I'm going to show the results on several different data sets that we looked at, really towards sort of reproducibility, making sure that the results that we're showing don't just work on one of our many data sets. So if we look at the results right here of this model trained on this data set, we can basically see frequency percentage on the y-axis and absolute percentage error on the x-axis. And you can note more or less the average performance, which is around 5 percentage error. And then also the worst case performance, which compares, it's a little hard to see, but the red crosses to the gray crosses. And you can see that the performance is not horrible, but it's not great. And so this is our completely naive baseline. And the question is, can we do something better? And what my student Saeed ended up coming up with is this MultiRes WNet architecture that basically started with the UNet and then made a series of adaptations that improved the performance. So yes?
Can you say a little bit more about what you're solving and what you're testing? Like in this problem. So you
yes.
do the test, you do a calculation, you train, and then you do some other calculations where you change something.
Yeah, so thank you for pausing. I'll take a second to clarify. So the whole data set, we have these input bitmaps, and we run finite element simulations. So in this case, it's equibiaxial finite element simulations to a fixed displacement. And then for each bitmap, which is 60,000 in the training data set and 10,000 in the test data set, matching the MNIST original data set, we will basically have our input bitmap. And then from the finite element simulations, we get a bunch of different output quantities of interest. In this particular case, we're looking at full field displacement sampled on a 28 by 28 grid. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so this is a relatively straightforward problem. One could construct more complicated problems from the data that we have available, but this was sort of our starting point right here. Yeah, and motivated by what we were seeing kind of in the literature, and also wanting to present something that was understandable for people who also don't necessarily have mechanics backgrounds. Because something that I'm kind of curious about is if we put mechanical data out into the world, can somebody with much more expertise than us in deep learning spend 5 minutes and come up with a better model? And if that happens, I would love to see it, genuinely. Yeah. So what's shown on this slide is what my PhD student, Saeed, came up with. And it's essentially a little bit of like this almost like Frankenstein architecture of looking out at the literature, trying a bunch of different things, and really trying to see what improved the performance on specifically this full field quantity of interest problem. So the first thing that he did was he went from a UNet model to a MultiRes UNet architecture. So that's adding MultiRes convolutional blocks and convolutional residual paths. The second thing, going from regular convolutions to depthwise separable convolutions. And then the third thing is going from this UNet to this WNet architecture and basically just stitching these two units together in a W. And in a very, very, very hand-wavy way, we think the reason why this is doing better than the UNet is because it makes it a little bit easier to sort of have like multi-resolution information be conveyed. So basically getting information from sort of like the boundaries to the inside and kind of establishing links there. But again, that's a very hand-wavy explanation. The truth of the matter is we tried a bunch of different things, and this is what did best. And it did best initially on these hyperelastic simulations. So this right here is the same plot that I showed you before, where again, frequency percentage on the Y, absolute percentage error on the X. In this particular example, we have our UNet results shown here again. Again, 4.51 is our mean absolute percent error. And then in this plot right here, same plot, different values on the axes. This is our proposed model. And you can see that the mean absolute percentage error goes down significantly. But then critically, the worst case scenario examples are also looking much better. And really, in engineering applications, we really don't want to be wrong, right? And these are much, much closer just sort of qualitatively than what we see over here. And this slide just shows a little bit more kind of details of the performance of our MultiRes WNet. So this plot right here, mean absolute percent error versus training set size. Things that are probably quite intuitive, right? Test error without data augmentation, test error with data augmentation, some visualizations of kind of mean performance of these networks. So this is what it actually looks like to have absolute percent error of 1%. And then these are histograms, and here we basically show these histograms with data augmentation for essentially 1, 2, 3, 4 of our mechanical MNIST data sets. So we have our mechanical MNIST uniaxial extension, equibiaxial extension, mechanical MNIST fashion, uniaxial extension, mechanical MNIST fashion, equibiaxial extension. And really the reason why we're showing results across 4 of these data sets is because we're kind of concerned about reproducibility, right? Like if we want to sort of say that we're proud of our particular deep learning approach, we want to be able to say that it does well on more than just one data set. We want to be able to show the performance across a suite of data sets. And actually, it kind of did so well. Oh, yes, please.
Yeah. So for the different data set, I'm just wondering, do the training individually on them?
Yes, yeah.
Separate models, right?
Separate training, separate trained models. Yeah. And any other questions or? Yeah, okay, so it did kind of so well on this hyperelastic problem that we were like, okay, we need something harder, we need something more interesting, we need more interesting mechanics. Let's create a data set with some material nonlinearity in it. And that's what led us to mechanical MNIST crackpath, where basically it's just linear elastic phase fields model simulations. And what we did was we turned the fashion MNIST bitmap into this kind of inclusion pattern. You can see that sort of looks like a shoe, but we wanted inclusions. Inclusions made the crack paths more interesting. So that's what we did here. We also threw in some additional randomness to make it a little bit harder. And then my graduate student, Saeed, designed essentially these strange boundary conditions that, to be totally honest, are a balance between 2 things. One thing is sufficiently diverse crack paths. It was actually surprisingly hard to get different crack paths. We tried a lot of more traditional looking boundary conditions, and the data set just wasn't very diverse. So you can see 3 different examples here. Those 3 crack paths after the initial cut are non-overlapping, and then it's also pretty easy to see in the force versus displacement curve that you're getting fundamentally different behavior here. And so that was one thing. And then the other thing to balance is that we wanted to be able to run 70,000 simulations and then read the results of 70,000 simulations, not track down 10,000 simulations that crashed. So that's sort of how we landed on this geometry. And then before I show you the results on this crackpath data set, I'll just point out that we've also identified the F1 score as a good error metric to use here. If you look at the equation for F1 score, the key thing to notice is that the true negative pixels are not included. If we included the true negative pixels, then we would get like 99.99% accuracy no matter what we did. So just one kind of small thing to point out. And this is how I'm going to present the results, following essentially this color code, where if you see a red crack path, that's correct. And any sort of discoloration around the margins, like those zooms in right there, are examples of the crack path being imperfect. So these are results on our mechanical MNIST crack path data set. Just purely quantitatively, the average F1 score was 0.87, which we were like, OK, that's pretty good. But qualitatively, also, what does that mean to us? And so what we ended up doing was we plotted, again, a histogram, frequency percentage versus F1 score. And all of the crack paths in our data set were continuous. So we separated out the discontinuous and continuous crack paths. And we also sort of qualitatively classified them as these correct predictions, and then also these incorrect predictions. You can see some examples right there with discontinuous crack paths. And then this third group that we thought was kind of the most interesting in some ways, this like plausible alternative paths group, where essentially the crack path is continuous, and it almost maybe even sort of looks correct, especially if you superimpose it on top of the inclusion matrix. But it's wrong. It's not getting the correct answer. And these sort of plausible alternative paths have also motivated some ongoing work that I only have one slide on, where essentially if you have different model initializations. Oh, yes, please.
The fracture is really a stochastic process, meaning really, I guess in your continuum model, it's deterministic?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so that question is perhaps maybe going to be the intro to the paper that we're trying to work on here, where essentially if you train the model with different initializations, in some cases it spits out different predictions. So this top row is 10 different model initializations. And you can see if you take those 10 predictions, superimpose them, and put them over the background matrix, you can kind of convince yourself that maybe, if we had a more kind of stochastic model where maybe the position of the inclusions could vary a little bit, or perhaps it wasn't in the continuum setting or something like that, these plausible alternative paths would potentially mean something, maybe. And essentially, if we take these and use an ensemble approach with just some simple voting, we can actually leverage this to get better predictions. But then I also like this picture because, to me, it looks very sort of mechanically informed, but at the end of the day, it's not. And I want to sort of understand that a little bit better and understand how to do better here. This is very much an open area of research, and that kind of brings us into our third pillar right here, which is this, kind of exciting idea, right, that there are things that are truly special about mechanical data, and how can we use that to inspire new machine learning methods? And in this third pillar right here, to be totally honest, this is work that a lot of other groups have done really beautiful work on. What I'm going to show here is just some of what we're kind of starting out with. We've been focused a little bit more on developing our non-physics informed baselines, but I think this is kind of like, I think this is a very exciting topic. I'll sort of leave that out there. So again, right, mechanical data is unique. Can it potentially be used to inform the development of machine learning methods? And one thing that often motivates us, especially because we work with a lot of experimental collaborators, is that if you look at a plot of something like test error versus number of training samples, when you're applying these deep learning methods, you probably want to be sort of more over in that blue box, right, at the point of kind of diminishing returns. But in real world conditions, we're more often than not up here in that red box where we wish we had more data. So the question is, can we use information about mechanics to motivate sort of new machine learning frameworks that can do better, perhaps in this limited data regime? So one thing that a lot of people have done some nice work on that we wanted to sort of have reflected in our data set is this idea of multi-fidelity modeling. So what I'm showing right here is an example where we've taken our mechanical MNIST data set and then also published multiple levels of data fidelity. So this upper row here essentially shows our full fidelity simulations, where again we have uniaxial extension, equibiaxial extension. We have a 3D example right in there. And then this lower row right here shows sort of our low fidelity data sets that go along with that. So here's where we do things that would probably upset my computational mechanics professors. Like, for example, we'll look at an unrefined mesh. We'll look at linear elements when we know we're supposed to be using quadratic elements. We'll look at maybe perturbations when we know we really want a large deformation. And the thing that we're kind of wondering is whether or not these low fidelity simulations can be leveraged and incorporated into these machine learning frameworks. And a lot of other people have done really nice work on this. This is just sort of our contribution within the mechanical MNIST framework. And we run all of our simulations with Phoenix, which isn't necessarily the fastest code. But the numbers to keep in mind, right, we're interested in seeing if simulations that take fractions of a second can be leveraged to make predictions about simulations that run in minutes or hours. And this is just one example of that right here, where we've looked at a really simple transfer learning approach, sort of multi-fidelity modeling maybe as a subset of transfer learning. And we've looked at a transfer learning approach that is quite simple to implement. A lot of people in this room have probably used it before. Where you essentially just use simple model pre-training, where you just train your initial data set you train your initial model with a low fidelity data set, and then you perform some additional training with a limited subset of high fidelity data, or a limited high fidelity data set. And in our particular case right here, we're looking at like linear elements, unrefined mesh, perturbation simulations as our low fidelity data set. And then our high fidelity data set is 3D, larger deformations, refined mesh, quadratic elements, all those things. So on this plot right here, mean absolute percentage error on the y, and then number of 3D or expensive training data sets, training samples on the x-axis. And then these curves correspond to different amounts of low fidelity data. So the black curve is the performance you get when you don't use any low fidelity data. And then these red curves are increasing amounts of low fidelity data. And again, this is a really simple to implement method, but the thing that I think is interesting here is that without transfer learning to generate this high fidelity data set, you do really need some sort of supercomputer. But with transfer learning, you could, we did generate these on our workstation, but you could generate them on your laptop or desktop and achieve essentially the same test error. And this is perhaps a relatively kind of like easy example in some ways, but I think it also sort of sets up an interesting question that's how can you design your low fidelity data set in the most effective way? And that's something that I just think is very interesting. And I look forward to seeing sort of non-intuitive solutions that are going to kind of emerge over the next several years, or at least I think they will. We'll see. So another problem that we've been thinking about a lot, and again, trying to really set up kind of a baseline here, is this general idea of sort of out-of-distribution data in mechanics. So before I showed multi-fidelity data sets, which is maybe sort of related to out-of-distribution data. But what I'm going to talk about here is maybe this more dramatic example where, say, I train on these numbers, but I want to predict on these Cahn-Hilliard patterns. And so far, we've been really approaching this kind of from develop the data set and baseline problem first, and then develop the method out around that angle. But I'll show you kind of what we've been working on here. And yeah, it might offer resources to people who are interested in this problem. And I'll just point out quickly that this is joint work with my colleague Harold Park at BU. And our student Ling Zhao is the one who's been driving all of this. So just as like a very, very brief introduction to out-of-distribution generalization, For machine learning models, we know that they work well when the data is independent and identically distributed. You have some distribution that you're drawing your training data from and your test data from. That's what they're designed for, right? But in real world conditions, we might end up here, right? You might train, stock prices or the housing market on 2015 through 2019, but then what you care about is the year 2020, and that's not gonna work, or I don't think it will. What we're kind of thinking about here is this perhaps more tractable example where you have multiple potential training environments that are related, but not necessarily identical to the test data environment that you're training on. And this is perhaps more relevant for experimental data sets, where maybe you have different people collecting your data sets, or maybe subtle things are changing in your materials that you don't fully understand. But what we're going to show here is just our initial setup within the mechanical MNIST framework of trying to look at sort of a computational kind of framework almost for just starting to look at these problems relevant to mechanics specifically. So again, from sort of the data sets approach, there are a few different types of out-of-distribution problems. We've identified 3 of them that we're interested in. This first one is this covariate shift problem, where essentially your input distribution is going to change, but your output distribution will not change very much across different environments that you are interested in. So here, our output distribution is the strain energy across 4 different environments, and our input distribution reflects essentially our modulus. And we're able to create this covariate shift by changing the distribution of elastic modulus present in the domain. So the elastic modulus in the domain will range from 1 for the background matrix to S for the stiff inclusion. And if we keep this thing so that the stiff inclusion kind of always behaves rigidly, we can stay within this kind of covariate shift range, where we're decreasing the maximum modulus, but our outputs aren't necessarily changing that much. So here we have 2 training environments where our maximum stiffness is 100 and 90, and then 2 test environments where our maximum stiffness is going to be 75 and 50. We can also take this farther and introduce a different type of out-of-distribution problem. This we've called mechanism shift because it doesn't necessarily have a super good map to other literature in out-of-distribution generalization. And the idea here is that not only are your input distributions different between training and test, but your output distributions will also shift. And the way that we do that in this specific context is we actually lower the stiffness of our inclusion so much that it's no longer behaving rigidly, right? Your inclusion starts to deform significantly, and then that also will change your output distribution quite a bit. So again, training environments, very rigid inclusions, and then test environments with quite soft inclusions, and you get this shift across your different environments. And then the third type of out-of-distribution generalization problem that we've been looking at is this thing that is called sampling bias. And again, this might tend to sort of come up more often in experimental data sets, or it might be something that kind of gets accidentally introduced when people are pre-processing the data by factors beyond our control. But what Zhao did was she actually identified a spurious feature, so one that is not going to have a stable correlation across different environments with the output that we care about. And what she did here was she just defined a spurious feature as the sum of modulus across the whole domain, which is related, but is not necessarily a perfect correlation between your change in strain energy, right? That's going to depend on the load paths that develop. So you could have very different geometries that sum moduli differently and lead to different outcomes. And then across each one of these different environments, the backgrounds here essentially show the selection probability. So in the first training environment, the spurious feature and the strain energy are highly correlated. In the second training environment, there's this neutral or perhaps slightly negative correlation. And then in the testing environment, we have 2 negative correlations. And then we also have this just sort of no sampling biases applied. This is the relationship between our spurious feature and our output if there's no sampling bias applied. So we have these sort of 3 types of out-of-distribution problems. And we've also done this in addition to mechanical MNIST, not to add more kind of confusion here with additional data sets. But again, we wanted to sort of evaluate these results on multiple data sets because we felt it would be more robust. We also have some MNIST letters examples where we do the exact same thing, just with different bitmaps. And then we looked at the literature and picked out a few out-of-distribution generalization algorithms and decided to evaluate them and sort of see how they did on these mechanics data sets. So the first sort of algorithm that we looked at doesn't care about out-of-distribution generalization. This is just empirical risk minimization. And the way that these machine learning models are trained, it's basically just to minimize the risk across all environments. There's no special term for out-of-distribution generalization. But then we looked at invariant risk minimization, risk extrapolation, and intergradient alignment, 3 additional examples from the literature. And the key thing with all of these terms, these objectives that are being minimized, is that they have a first term that looks a lot like empirical risk minimization, but then they have a second term that applies some sort of penalty to the fact that different environments might have different performance. So it's just trying to make performance across the different environments consistent. That's what these algorithms are doing. And this is what the results look like. So these are the covariate shift results for the covariate shift data set. We have our MNIST data set here, our MNIST letters data set here. We used a simple LUNet neural network architecture. And then we have our training and validation results on training environments 1 through 2. And then we have our test results here. And for the covariate shift data sets, we found that all out-of-distribution algorithms outperformed the empirical risk minimization for both mechanical MNIST and MNIST letters. And there isn't necessarily a clear story on which one is best. Perhaps risk extrapolation works well because it's convenient to implement. But you can make arguments either way. The point is that these algorithms are fairly successful on this type of out-of-distribution generalization for problems in mechanics. With mechanism shift, it's a relatively similar story. It's not perfectly the same. But again, the performance on the test data of the algorithms that are specifically designed for out-of-distribution generalization, so these red lines and red markers, the error is lower than what we have for the black line right here. So all of our out-of-distribution algorithms outperform empirical risk minimization for the mechanism shift type of problem. And then for the third outcome, which is sampling bias, this is where the out-of-distribution algorithms didn't really offer us much. And in this particular case, you can see the black line here and the red line here. The out-of-distribution algorithms performed really similarly to empirical risk minimization on both the mechanical MNIST and MNIST letters data set. So again, this is really to kind of establish like a baseline of algorithms that are not necessarily mechanics specific or physics informed on out-of-distribution generalization. And really sort of what we've been trying to do here is kind of motivate what is going to perhaps be kind of most challenging and most interesting for us or potentially others, because all of the data is out there, to jump into and try to define out-of-distribution generalization algorithms that are going to be sort of robust and effective on mechanics data. So that's something that we're working on a bit now, but again, the data sets are out there. And that is sort of the third pillar of what we've been working on here. So really, like, my group has been super excited about this project of generating benchmark data sets. Showed you all some snapshots focused on education and dissemination, machine learning methods applied to mechanical data, and then this third kind of perhaps most interesting question of mechanical data being used to sort of inform machine learning methods. And we've tried to set up sort of frameworks that enable this and really serve as a resource for the broader research community. I just have a couple of slides to click through real quick. I'm just advertising some additional data sets that we've worked on. This one, buckling instability classification, is quite simple. It's perhaps most useful for education or just playing around. It's a really small data set. Well, it has a lot of samples in it, but the file size is small here. We also have gotten really interested in graph neural network approaches, which motivated us to develop this asymmetric buckling columns data set, where we're really interested in kind of complex architectures and how we might best interact with them, again, for mechanics problems. This is a data set that our experimental collaborators put together, and we worked with them a bit on dissemination, which is basically these really sort of careful experiments, and to be honest, kind of time and cost expensive experiments on essentially sampling the mechanical behavior of the heart ventricles. And we also have another pattern here, because I don't know, we were sick of doing things on numbers and fashion patterns. We wanted some more sort of mechanics-y looking inputs, so we looked at a Cahn-Hilliard data set, so we have all of that online as well. And finally, I just want to encourage anyone who might be interested to think about taking a look at our iMechanica post, or just letting me know if there are data sets that I'm missing that I could include on this crowdsourced list. Right now, I think I have like 14 examples, and there's got to be more out there. I'm sure there's hundreds. And yeah, always feel free to send me an email or come talk to me. And thank you all very much for listening. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation to come speak here.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, very nice talk. So here you show you kind of borrow some borrow some data set from other community developed, then convert them into like a mechanical with a very good open access. Yeah. So I'm wondering for the next step is like, is there a kind of systematic way for us to construct a data set just for mechanical problem? Like here, you show the numbers can be translated into inclusion and the matrix. So it's saying we have a fixed mesh, then I can want to cover all the possible, or try to construct a complete set. Then is there a kind of way or strategy for that? Thank you.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, your question is kind of asking like, sort of, maybe this is a start of how to get going. Is there sort of like a future vision for how to do this best and kind of like in an all-inclusive way?
That we can kind of understand the complexity of all the possibilities, like the smallest but sufficient.
Yeah, so are you thinking sort of like, say that you have a 28 by 28 domain and you want to allow any material properties, or are you thinking even broader than that, like all mechanical problems? Yeah, so I think the 28 by 28 grid where you could have arbitrary patterns, trying to think about questions like that was part of our motivation for looking at some of this out-of distribution work, and then also more recently on some of this stuff with generative models. I think that is a really cool challenge problem. I'm actually not sure how to construct the best data set for that. One could perhaps try to intermingle between MNIST and fashion MNIST and look at that performance, or intermingle between the MNIST, fashion MNIST, and these Cahn-Hilliard patterns and see if an algorithm performed well there. But I think that might be one of those things where the most effective thing to do would be to have the code kind of be the thing that's kind of shared and part of the benchmark data set. And with all of these data sets, the code is shared. So if you wanted to train something on MNIST and try it on an arbitrary pattern, you could run the Phoenix code and also look at that. I think to your second question, which is maybe the even bigger, like kind of all of mechanics question, I think that's very much an open question. Our approach here has been to just try and link to data sets that people have developed for their own niche interests. I'm not necessarily sure that there's like one simulation or one experiment that encompasses all of mechanics. It might be a little bit kind of too diverse to do that. But I think it would be really cool if people could come up with better ideas than what I've had, because I just think it would be absolutely fascinating to think about construction of data sets for this purpose. Does that answer? It's kind of a non-answer to your question, but it's a really good question. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
I use the microphone.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, because people on Zoom will hear.
Okay. Hi. Correct me if I'm wrong. So you use a finite element simulation to calculate images, and then you train a machine learning algorithm on these images to predict some kind of property.
Yeah, so the bitmaps are the inputs to both the finite element simulations and our machine learning frameworks. So the bitmaps dictate the heterogeneous material property space, and then the bitmaps then become the inputs to our machine learning models. Yes.
Okay, so then what is the output you're training the machine learning model
Yeah,
on?
so the output depends a little bit problem to problem. In single quantity of interest problems, we've largely looked at predicting overall change in strain energy for some given applied displacement. In the second example that I showed, sort of like the second pillar, we were looking at full field quantities of interest. And in our paper, we looked at displacement fields, strain fields, and also damage fields, trying to have kind of some diversity there.
Okay, so as far as I understand you, you have a very good physics-based model which predicts these quantities more or less perfectly.
Well, we have a physics-based model that we're using to generate our data sets. Whether or not it predicts them perfectly, we believe that it's numerically validated and accurate. If you were to take a given heterogeneous material, would it be perfectly captured by the simulation? The answer is it depends. But
yeah, I mean,
yes.
in the sense of the training algorithm. So, okay, then my question is, why are you throwing away all that physics knowledge you have and just train on the data?
Yeah, and I think that question is exactly spot on, right? So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to develop almost like a framework for which one could compare models that are highly informed by physics to models that are not informed by physics and just informed by data. And what we're showing here is essentially the machine learning baselines, and the next step is some hybrid between machine learning and mechanistic models.
Yeah, okay, now a critical question, and I pose that very critical. I don't really think that myself, but why would you need a data-driven model if you have a perfectly fine physics-based model?
Yeah.
Which you can predict everything you just showed more or less perfectly in the training sense.
Yeah, I love that question. I think, I think the boring answer is that sometimes if you can go really fast, it enables you to do more, right? All of these examples here, your machine learning model could potentially evaluate much more quickly, but that's not necessarily the exciting answer, right? Because one could make an argument that you could use a different approach to do that. The thing that is really most exciting to me is that what I would like to do is actually apply these machine learning methods to problems where we don't have an underlying model. And I'm viewing the benchmark data sets as essentially like a playground or kind of synthetic environment to test out the performance of these algorithms with a known ground truth, because the next steps of our research are very much leveraging thousands or tens of thousands of experiments and trying to build models from that. And in this particular example right here, in some ways, it's a very simple biological system. It's an in vitro tissue model. But in other ways, it's incredibly complicated and fascinating with emergent behavior and things we don't understand. And that's where I think the utility, at least for my personal interests, is going to be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I show these movies, so I can come back to this if someone asks me that question at the end.
Any other question? Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I just had one question. I was wondering if the kind of the neural network architecture that you decide to use, how does that depend on the, or is there any relationship with the material model? Like if you're trying to model linear elasticity, is one type of architecture good versus if you have like nonlinear effects? Do you need to add other features to the architecture in order to be able to capture that? I was just wondering if you're able to kind of come up with any kind of relationships there.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So your question is sort of like, do you find that if there are more nonlinearities in your data set, do you need a more complicated machine learning model, more or less? Is that kind of your question?
Yeah, and how does that model like differ? Like, do you need different features in that architecture?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that we very loosely, like in a hand-wavy way, find that if there are more nonlinearities in our data, we do need a more complicated machine learning model. I think the other thing that's really interesting, and we don't really have anything definitive to say on this, more it's just kind of an observation. I'm just skipping to the correct slide. For data sets like this one and this one, where the input features are basically just coming from like random number generators, our machine learning models actually do much worse than in scenarios where our input features have some sort of underlying structure or pattern to them. And I think that's essentially because by some metrics, these data sets kind of have more kind of diversity or less opportunity for kind of unsupervised kind of like pattern identification to work. And I think that, I don't know, I kind of answered your question by just bringing up other issues. But yeah, I'm really excited about sort of, the notion that looking at kind of mechanics data sets and approaching them with some kind of mechanics expertise can allow us to define more challenging problems for these machine learning approaches. Yeah, sorry, that was not an answer to your question. It was just more talking, but yeah.
So given that it's 1 o'clock, I think we should thank our speaker one more time for a very nice talk.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.